The rust-hued dust of Xylo settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that worked its way into the joints of power armor and the lungs of mercenaries. For Lord Commander Kalen of the Ethelgard hegemony, it was the taste of his exile. He stood on the balcony of his command spire, a jagged shard of obsidian carved from the planet's native rock, and surveyed the battle-scarred valley below. Tracer fire, brilliant streaks of emerald and gold, stitched the perpetual twilight. The emerald belonged to the coral synthesis, or rather, their Xylan proxies disciplined, coordinated volleys from plasma repeaters. The gold was his own, the chaotic, brutish roar of kinetic autocannons wielded by Cathar mercenaries, hulking brutes who fought for hegemony coin and the sheer love of destruction. It was a scene Kalen had witnessed on a dozen different worlds, in 100 different configurations. The same grinding, honorless conflict that defined the Veil of Silence. For 3 standard centuries, the hegemony and the synthesis had been locked in this cold embrace of war, a conflict fought not with grand fleets and glorious charges, but through proxies and pawns on forgotten worlds like this one, the Ethelgard, a species engineered for perfection, warriors whose very DNA screamed for decisive, honorable combat, were instead mired in endless attrition. The synthesis, a collective of symbiotic species linked in a silent, seamless consciousness, thrived in this shadow war, their subversion and infiltration a cancer that gnawed at the hegemony's fringes. Neither side dared escalate to open war. Their fleets were too evenly matched, their doomsday weapons too absolute. The resulting stalemate was a galactic wound that refused to heal, and Xylos was just another festering scab. Kalen was a product of the old way, a strategist trained in the grand fleet maneuvers of the legendary Star Marshals. He saw the battlefield not as a chaotic brawl, but as a complex equation of force, vectors, and timing. And the equation of Xylos was simple. It could not be solved. For every meter of ground his mercenaries gained, the coral-backed Xylans would reclaim too, not through superior strength, but through maddeningly perfect coordination. They moved as one organism, their battle lines shifting and flowing with a prescience that felt less like strategy and more like a biological imperative. Kalen's command was a punishment, a gilded cage for a mind that had spoken truth to the hegemony's ossified High Council. He had argued for a shift in doctrine, for an end to the charade of honorable combat in a war that had none. He had called the Veil a self-inflicted wound that would bleed their empire dry. For his prescience, he was sent here to command mercenaries and watch his career dissolve into the red dust. He gripped the cold stone of the balcony rail, his knuckles white. The war wasn't just unwinnable, it was stagnant, a putrid mire of recycled tactics and predictable outcomes. The change began not with a bang, but with a whisper of silence from the Galactic East, a sector of the Veil so remote and strategically insignificant that neither the hegemony nor the synthesis bothered to maintain more than a skeleton force of listening posts. The first was Synthesis Relay 734, a deep space comms hub designed to monitor stellar nursery activity. It simply went dark. No distress call, no energy signature flare from a weapon's discharge, no wreckage. It just ceased to exist on the network. The synthesis, in their silent, inscrutable way, likely assumed a stellar anomaly or a catastrophic system failure. A week later, the Ethelgard patrol cutter, Vigilant Blade, on a long-range sweep of the same sector, vanished. This time, a final data burst was recorded, but it was corrupted, nonsensical. All hegemony analysts could decipher were fragments of the ship's sensor logs detecting a single, cold object moving with impossible velocity and no discernible energy trail. It was dismissed as a sensor ghost, a phantom created by the sector's gravitational tides. But Kalen, who reviewed every significant incident report that crossed the veil, saw a pattern: 2 disappearances, one from each side, in the same remote sector, both characterized by a profound and unnatural lack of evidence. It was too clean, too precise. It was a move on the Galactic chessboard made by a player he didn't recognize, following rules he didn't know. He voiced his concerns to his superiors on the capital world of Ethel, but his report was buried under a mountain of bureaucratic indifference. A disgraced commander on a backwater world seeing phantoms in the dark was of little concern to the gilded warlords of the High Council. They were focused on the next glorious, pointless offensive, the next opportunity to posture and preen while the Empire slowly rotted from within. So Kalen watched, and he waited. He repurposed deep-range sensors on Xylos, turning them away from the battlefield and toward the silent east, listening for another whisper. It came 3 weeks later, not a disappearance, but something far stranger. A coral scout phalanx, 3 sleek, biological vessels that moved in perfect, silent unison, was detected diverting from its patrol route. They changed course abruptly, moving toward an empty point in space, a system with no strategic value, no habitable worlds, nothing but a dying dwarf star. They maintained their new course for 12 hours, then, one by one, their biological energy signatures winked out. Again, no battle, no debris, just cessation. It was like watching 3 candles being calmly, deliberately snuffed out. The war on Xylos raged on, oblivious. The Cathar mercenaries bellowed their war cries. The Xylan militias held their lines, and the red dust drank the blood and oil of both. Kalen fought his war with the chilling sense that he was a child playing with toy soldiers while a giant watched from the shadows. Then, the giant moved its hand. The epicenter of the Coral Synthesis's entire planetary operation on Xylos was a fortified command and control nexus buried deep within the heart of the Great Northern Mountain, a fortress known to the hegemony as the Hive. From this subterranean brain, the Coral Hive Mind directed every Zealand soldier, every drone, every automated turret on the planet with instantaneous, flawless precision. It was the single most important strategic target on the planet, and for 50 years it had been impregnable. Hegemony forces had thrown legions against it, shattered orbital bombardment platforms on its shields, and lost entire companies of elite shock troops in its labyrinthine tunnels. The Hive was the heart of the enemy, and it could not be stopped until it was. On the 3rd cycle of the Xylan Day, it simply went dark. The entire mountain fortress, a place that pulsed with more energy than a small city, went electronically and psychically inert. Kalen was in his command center reviewing troop dispositions when the alert flashed across his tactical display. One of his junior officers, a young Ethelgard noble with more ambition than sense, cheered. "Lord Commander, our orbital assets must have finally punched through. The Hive is down." Kalen silenced him with a glare. He stared at the display, a cold dread coiling in his gut. The planetary sensor grid showed no orbital lance strike. There was no seismic upheaval from a bunker-busting ordnance, no residual radiation, no atmospheric distortion. The Hive hadn't been destroyed. It had been turned off. He watched the real-time battlefield map and saw the immediate, catastrophic effect. The once flawless lines of the Xylan militias dissolved into chaos. Squads fired on each other in confusion. Automated defenses fell silent. The perfect coordination that had made them so formidable was gone, replaced by the panicked disarray of an anthill that had lost its queen. And it was a decisive, war-winning moment. A complete strategic decapitation, but it wasn't his victory. The hegemony had not done this. The methods were wrong. There was no glory in it, no thunderous application of overwhelming force. It was silent, surgical, and utterly terrifying. He knew what he had to do. The High Council would have ordered a full-scale assault to capitalize on the chaos, to storm the hive and claim a victory they hadn't earned. But Kalen needed to understand. He needed to see. Ignoring protocol, he assembled a small reconnaissance team, the best of his own Ethel Guard, and boarded a swift, low-profile skimmer. They flew north, over the now stuttering battlefield, the mercenaries below tearing into the confused Xylan forces with renewed savagery. As they approached the mountain, an eerie silence descended. The constant thrum of the hive's energy shields was gone. The air was still. They landed the skimmer at the main entrance, a colossal blast door, 20 meters thick, now hanging slightly ajar, its power source dead. Kalen and his 4 guards entered, their pulse rifles raised, combat sensors sweeping the oppressive darkness. The interior was pristine. There were no scorch marks on the walls, no bodies littering the corridors. Emergency lighting cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. They passed barracks and armories filled with Xylan soldiers and the strange symbiotic choral directors who guided them. They were all there, standing or sitting at their posts, weapons in hand, eyes wide and unfocused. They weren't dead. Scanners showed their biological functions were intact, but they were empty, vacant shell, like puppets whose strings had been cut. Their collective consciousness, the psychic network that bound them all together into the single entity of the synthesis, was gone. It had been erased. Kalen felt a primal fear he hadn't known since his first battle as a young cadet. This wasn't warfare. It was pest control. They moved deeper, toward the central command chamber, the very nexus of the hive mind. The air grew colder, and a low, resonant hum vibrated through the soles of his armored boots. The doors to the chamber stood open. Inside, the vast circular room was dominated by a pulsing, organic computer, the biological core of the hive. And floating silently in the exact center of the room was the source of the hum. It was a small, sleek object, no larger than his own torso, a construct of a matte black material that seemed to drink the light. It had no visible seams, no insignia, no weapon ports, and it was utterly nondescript. Yet it radiated an aura of immense and ancient power. As Kalen and his team stepped into the chamber, the probe reacted. It didn't power up a weapon or raise a shield. It simply projected a message, a string of perfect, classical Ethelgard characters, onto the dormant central view screen. The script was flawless, the grammar impeccable. It read, "This territory is now under quarantine. All biological and psychic networks are considered compromised assets. Cease all hostilities. Your compliance is not requested. It is a precondition for non-interference." Kalen stared, his mind struggling to process the implications. Quarantine, compromised assets, non-interference. These were not the words of a conqueror. They were the words of a physician isolating a disease, of a cleaner sterilizing a contaminated room. This new power had not come to fight them, to challenge the hegemony for territory or resources. It had simply observed their endless, futile war, judged it a sickness, and had begun, with cold and terrifying efficiency, to excise it from the galaxy. They had not defeated the coral hive mind with a greater weapon. They had simply unplugged it, rendering their entire way of life, their very consciousness, obsolete. Kalen looked at the inert coral beings around him, then back at the silent, hovering probe and its clinical message. The war he had fought his entire life, the grand conflict that had defined his civilization for centuries, was a meaningless squabble to this new entity. They were not warriors. They were not even rivals. They were a contamination. The probe pulsed once, a soft, silent throb of light, and Kalen finally understood. This was humanity, and their arrival did not signal the start of a new war, but the end of war itself. They were the apex predator, and the galaxy was their hunting ground. The silence in the hive's heart was a physical presence, a pressure against the ears that was more profound than any sound. Kalen stared at the classical Ethelgard script hanging in the air, a message of calm, absolute authority delivered by a faceless, featureless machine. His 4 guards stood frozen, their combat training utterly useless against an enemy that did not fight, but simply decreed. The probe made no further communication. It had delivered its edict, and now it waited, a silent, black sentinel. The implication was clear. The time for discussion was over. This was the new state of reality. Kalen finally broke the spell, his voice a low rasp in the sterile air. "We are leaving now." He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the probe. His guards followed suit, their movements tight with a tension that bordered on panic. They retreated through the silent corridors, past the rows of vacant Xylons and their choral masters, a planetary army reduced to a museum of biological statues. The walk back to the skimmer was the longest of Kalen's life. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, not of violence, but of that same silent, effortless erasure they had witnessed in the command chamber. When they emerged from the hive's entrance into the blood-red twilight of Xylos, the sounds of battle washed over them, a jarring, profane cacophony after the tomb-like silence within. The Cathar were on the hunt. With the Xylan command structure shattered, the fight had devolved into a slaughter. Kalen watched through his skimmer's view screen as a pack of the hulking, tusked mercenaries cornered a squad of disoriented Xylan militia. The Xylans had dropped their weapons, their faces blank with confusion, but the Cathar showed no mercy, their autocannons chewing through flesh and armor with gleeful abandon. The golden tracer fire that had once symbolized his campaign now looked like a vulgar stain against the sky. He keyed his command channel, his voice hard as iron. "All Cathar commanders, this is Lord Commander Kalen. Cease all offensive actions immediately. Consolidate your positions and await further orders. Acknowledge." The channel crackled with static and the din of combat. The only reply was a gruff, booming laugh from Grak, the Cathar battle lord, a scarred veteran whose loyalty was rented, not earned. "Cease fire, Commander. The bugs are broken. This is the best hunt we've had in a decade. The price just went up for a finished contract." Yes, Kalen's jaw tightened. This is not a negotiation, a Grak. This is a direct order. The strategic situation has changed. Pull your warriors back. The situation has changed for the better. Grak roared over the sound of an exploding Xylan vehicle. "We'll have this valley cleared by sunup Grak out." The channel went dead. Kalen slammed his fist against the console. The mercenaries were a tool he no longer controlled, a blunt instrument still swinging long after the sculpture was finished. They were violating the edict. They were testing the limits of a power they could not possibly comprehend. He didn't have to wait long for the response. As his skimmer lifted off, accelerating back toward his command spire, a change occurred on the battlefield below. It wasn't an explosion or a plasma strike. It was a sound, or rather, the ghost of one. A subsonic frequency that rippled through the valley, felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was the same low hum he had felt in the hive's core, now amplified to a planetary scale. He watched on the tactical display as every single golden icon representing a Cathar mercenary froze. Down below, the slaughter stopped mid-swing. A Cathar about to bring his combat knife down on a cowering Xylan simply stopped, his arm locked in place. The roaring autocannons fell silent, not because they were destroyed, but because the hands holding them would no longer pull the triggers. Across the entire valley, the entire mercenary army was paralyzed, frozen in their tracks like statues of conquest. Their vital signs, monitored through their contract-mandated biotrackers, were stable. They were alive, conscious, but their bodies no longer obeyed them. They were prisoners in their own flesh, forced to watch as the Xylans, slowly emerging from their stupor, stared back not with fear, but with a dawning, eerie placidity. A new message appeared on Kalen's private command frequency. It wasn't text this time. It was a single, elegant data packet. He opened it. It was a complete neurological schematic of the Cathar species, highlighting the specific motor neurons that had just been suppressed by the sonic frequency. Appended to it was a second file, a similar schematic for the Ethelgard. The message was unspoken, but brutally clear. "We know how you work. We can turn you off, too." Kalen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the skimmer's life support. This was their non-interference. They hadn't killed the mercenaries. Killing was messy, a relic of primitive conflict. They had simply removed their ability to be hostile. They had enforced the quarantine with the efficiency of a system administrator revoking a user's privileges. He immediately broadcast a message, this time not to the Cathar, but into the open, to the silent observer he knew was listening. "This is Lord Commander Kalen of the Ethelgard hegemony. We acknowledge the quarantine. My forces will stand down." There was no reply. None was needed, and the point had been made. Back in his spire, Kalen compiled his report for the High Council on Ethel. He included everything: the sensor logs of the vanishing ships, the full audio-visual recording from inside the hive, the text of the probe's message, and the real-time data of his mercenary army being neutralized by an invisible hand. He wrote a preamble, choosing his words with the care of a man disarming a bomb, urging caution and a complete strategic reassessment. He described the new power not as an enemy, but as a context-altering event, a force of nature that rendered their centuries-long war with the synthesis utterly irrelevant. He sealed the report with his command cipher and transmitted it across the veil, knowing full well he had just signed his own death warrant, or, at best, sealed his permanent exile. The reply came within hours, faster than he had expected. It was not a nuanced discussion of strategy. It was a summons. Star Marshal Valerius, the imperious leader of the hegemony's war council and Kalen's chief political rival, would be addressing him personally via subspace hologram. At the appointed time, the air in Kalen's command center shimmered and coalesced into the towering, perfect form of Valerius. The Star Marshal was the epitome of Ethelgard breeding tall, golden-haired, his face a mask of arrogant perfection, his ceremonial armor gleaming even in the holographic projection. He did not bother with pleasantries. "Lord Commander Kalen, I have reviewed your novel." Valerius's lip curled in a faint sneer. "You paint a vivid picture of phantoms and sorcery. A single, unidentified probe disables a coral hive that has resisted our battle groups for half a century, an entire army of Cathar brutes paralyzed by a sound. It is a convenient excuse for your own failure to secure a decisive victory on Xylos." Kalen stood his ground, his posture rigid. "Star Marshal, the data is appended. It is not an excuse, it is a factual report. A new power has entered the Veil. They call themselves humanity, and their technology operates on principles We do not understand. They have declared the system, likely the entire sector, a quarantine zone." Valerius laughed. "A short, ugly bark. A quarantine. They dare use such a word to the Ethelgard hegemony. We are the architects of this galaxy. We are the pinnacle of evolution. We are not some disease to be contained by upstart primitives who hide behind assassins' tricks and cowards' weapons. You have allowed yourself to be intimidated. Kalen, your exile has softened your spine. Honor has no place in a discussion of extinction." Valerius. Kalen countered, his voice dangerously low. "They did not challenge us to a glorious battle because they do not see us as worthy opponents. We are a disruptive element in their experiment, nothing more. To provoke them is to invite annihilation, not a worthy death in combat." Valerius's eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. "You speak of extinction, I speak of dominion. You see an obstacle, I see an opportunity. This humanity has shown us a new weapon, a way to cripple the synthesis without the cost of a fleet action. We will seize this technology. We will reverse engineer it. We will turn it upon the coral worlds. But first, we will reassert our authority." He leaned forward, his holographic image seeming to fill the room. "Ethelgard does not bow to ultimatums from phantoms. The third battle fleet has been dispatched from the core worlds. They will arrive in your sector in 3 days. Their orders are to breach this so-called quarantine, secure the hive, and dismantle this human probe for study. That your orders, Lord Commander, are to provide them with all necessary logistical support. You will show these newcomers the cost of insulting the hegemony." The hologram vanished, leaving Kalen alone in the suffocating silence of his command center. He stood for a long moment, the Star Marshal's arrogant words echoing in the air. The High Council hadn't listened. They had taken his precise, terrifying data and filtered it through their own lens of pride and tradition, seeing only what they wanted to see: an enemy to be crushed, a technology to be stolen. They were sending the Third Fleet, a glorious procession of gleaming warships and honor-bound warriors, into the jaws of a predator they refused to believe existed. They were sending them to die for an insult. On the other side of the veil, the coral synthesis was reacting very differently. While the hegemony blustered, the silent consciousness of the synthesis processed the loss of the Xylos node. It was a trauma, a psychic amputation that had sent ripples of confusion across their entire network. But the synthesis did not feel anger or wounded pride. It felt curiosity. This new variable, humanity, was not chaotic like the Ethelgard. It was precise, logical, and devastatingly effective. It was a mind of a different order. And so, from a dozen different hidden nebulae, the synthesis dispatched their own probes, not warships, but small, undetectable sensor drones. Their purpose not to fight or to challenge, but to watch, to listen, and to learn, to understand the nature of the entity that could so casually edit their very being out of existence. The Ethelgard were preparing for a war. The synthesis was preparing for a paradigm shift. Kalen looked out at the red dust of Xylos, at the frozen Cathar army and the placid, waiting Xylans. The Third Fleet was coming, and with them, they would bring the glorious, honorable, and utterly final wrath of humanity. The 3 days leading up to the Third Fleet's arrival were the quietest Xylos had been in a century. The war was over, but peace felt like a held breath. Kalen's mercenaries remained a frozen tableau across the valley, living monuments to humanity's silent power. The Cathar, trapped within their own bodies, could only watch as the Xylans, now free from the coral synthesis's control, moved among them. They were not hostile. In fact, they were helpful. They brought the paralyzed mercenaries water administered nutrient paste, and tended to their armor's failing life support systems with a detached, placid efficiency. It was the most unsettling thing Kalen had ever witnessed. The Xylans were no longer a hive mind, but they hadn't reverted to individuality either. They were a people becalmed, their violent impulses seemingly excised along with the choral consciousness. Humanity had not just removed an enemy, they had reprogrammed a species. He tried once more to send a detailed warning to the advancing fleet, a direct message to its commander, Fleetmaster Orin. The message simply dissolved into the ether, swallowed by a localized communications blackout around the Xylo system. The quarantine was not just a suggestion, it was a cage, and humanity controlled the lock. On the third day, they came, not as a subtle ripple in space-time, but as a glorious, arrogant tearing of the void. 20 warships of the Ethelgard hegemony's third battle fleet translated from subspace in perfect, intimidating formation. At their center was the indomitable Will, Orin's flagship, a Sun-Kraken-class dreadnought that was more a mobile city of death than a mere vessel. Flanking it were Glaive-class destroyers and Scythe-class cruisers, their silver hulls polished to a mirror sheen, each one a testament to the hegemony's martial pride. It was a pageant of military might designed to awe and terrify lesser races. To Kalen, watching the fleet's icons populate his tactical display, it looked like a funeral procession. Fleetmaster Orin's hologram appeared before him, even sharper and more disdainful than Valerius's had been. Orin was younger, his perfect features etched with the eager cruelty of a true believer. He had risen through the ranks on glory and conquest, and had never known a battle he could not win through sheer, overwhelming force. Lord Commander Kalen, Orin's voice was clipped, dismissive. Your dereliction of duty ends today. Transmit the last known coordinates of this phantom probe. My extermination teams will handle it from there. We will cleanse this system of your cowardice and this human filth in one glorious stroke. Kalen met the Fleetmaster's gaze without flinching. Fleetmaster Orin, I am formally advising you to stand down your fleet. You are in violation of a quarantine enforced by a Tier 1 power. Your ships are outmatched. Your doctrines are obsolete. Your presence here is an act of suicide. Orin laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Your concern is noted and discarded. We are the Ethelgard. Our might is the only Tier 1 power in this galaxy. Now, the coordinates. Kalen knew it was hopeless, but he had to try. They are not warriors. Orin, they will not meet you in an honorable fleet engagement. You are marching into a slaughterhouse. Then it is a slaughterhouse I will consecrate with their blood. Orin snarled. The coordinates, Kalen, or I will have you stripped of rank and spaced for treason. Kalen slowly raised a hand and pointed a single trembling finger toward the largest of Xylos's 3 barren moons. It was last seen in orbit of the moon Kai. But you will not find it there. It will find you. Orin's hologram vanished with a final sneer. On the tactical display, Kalen watched the Third Fleet adjust its formation, a predator closing in on its prey. They moved with the flawless precision for which the Ethelgard were famed, a beautiful, deadly dance of power and purpose. Their primary weapon systems began to charge, the energy signatures of 20 warships painting the sensor screen with blooming flowers of imminent destruction. They were preparing a system-wide sterilization pattern, intending to glass the moon and everything around it. Then, the human response came. It began not with a counterattack, but with the Third Fleet's own sensors. One moment, they were reading a clear, unobstructed view of the system. The next, they were reading nothing, not static, not jamming, but a perfect, absolute void of information. It was as if the universe beyond their hulls had been deleted. All external sensors on all 20 ships went simultaneously, inexplicably blind. On the bridge of the indomitable will, Orin slammed his fist on his command throne. "Report! What is this trickery?" His sensor officers worked frantically, their faces pale. "Fleet Master, it's impossible. All long-range and short-range arrays are reporting total sensory deprivation. It's not a jamming signal. It's an absence of signal. There's nothing there." Before Orin could process this, the true attack began. It was not a torpedo, not a laser, not a kinetic strike. It was a broadcast, a single, silent, tight beam transmission aimed not at the ships, but at the Ethelgard crews within them. It was a stream of pure data, a cognitive plague designed for a single purpose: to unravel the genetic cornerstone of the Ethelgard hegemony. For millennia, the Ethelgard had bred themselves for perfection, systematically editing their own genome to suppress what they considered base instincts: fear, panic, doubt, irrationality. They were beings of pure logic, discipline, and martial focus. The human broadcast was a key, a viral code that unlocked every genetic gate their ancestors had so carefully locked. It didn't attack them. It re-enabled them. Across the 20 ships, thousands of Ethelgard warriors and officers suddenly experienced, for the first time in their lives, the raw, unfiltered chaos of a primal mind. A gunnery officer, about to fire a world-killing lance, was suddenly crippled by a wave of vertigo and a paralyzing fear of the vast, empty space beyond his viewport. A navigator, whose mind was a flawless computer of stellar mechanics, screamed as the numbers on his screen dissolved into terrifying, meaningless symbols. Engineers stared at the reactor consoles, overcome by a sudden crushing despair that rendered them unable to act. The bridges of the Ethelgard fleet, once temples of silent, efficient command, devolved into bedlam. Captains babbled incoherently. Officers clawed at their own faces, shrieking at phantoms only they could see. The perfect, logical minds that guided the warships had been shattered, flooded with 1 billion years of repressed evolutionary terror. The fleet, deprived of its flawless guidance, destroyed itself, the glaive of justice. Its navigator, catatonic, veered sharply and plowed into the side of the cruiser Pride of Ethel. The resulting explosion of their core reactors vaporized both ships in a silent, brilliant flash. The dreadnought Valerius's Fist, its engineering crew lost to a collective psychotic break, suffered a catastrophic reactor breach, its massive spine snapping in two before it vanished in a wave of plasma. Ship after ship fell into chaos, colliding with one another, firing weapons blindly into the void, or simply going inert as their crews descended into madness. It was not a battle, it was a contagion. A glorious fleet was committing suicide, its own perfection turned against it. Kalen watched the horror unfold from his spire, his face a grim, stony mask. He saw the icons on his tactical display wink out, one after another. He listened to the final, panicked, insane screams that bled across the hegemony's command channels before they, too, fell silent. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. Of the 20 warships of the 3rd Battle Fleet, 19 were gone, reduced to expanding clouds of radioactive dust and frozen wreckage. Only one remained, the flagship, the indomitable Will. It was adrift, its engines dead, its hull scarred by debris from its sister ships, but it was intact. Humanity had left a survivor. They had left a witness. As the last echoes of the fleet's self-destruction faded, a single line of text appeared on Kalen's main view screen. It was the same flawless, classical Ethelgard script as before, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that the same message was appearing on the emergency screens of Fleet Master Orin's ruined bridge. It read, "Perfection is a fragile state. Your quarantine will now be observed." Kalen sank into his command chair, the strength gone from his limbs. The hegemony had sent its best and brightest to assert its dominance. They had come bearing the weight of 10,000 years of martial pride, and humanity hadn't even deemed them worthy of a fight. They had simply held up a mirror and forced the Ethelgard to gaze upon the monster of imperfection they had tried to bury within themselves, and the sight had destroyed them. The war with the synthesis was a forgotten memory. The hegemony's reign was a fading dream. This was the dawn of a new age, and it had begun with the quiet, effortless murder of a god. The wreckage of the Third Battle Fleet hung in the void around Xylos like a celestial graveyard, a silent, glittering testament to the hegemony's hubris. On the bridge of the indomitable will, Fleetmaster Orin was one of the few who had retained a semblance of sanity. Though the experience had irrevocably broken him, he had watched his perfect, disciplined crew tear themselves and their ship apart, their minds shattered by the human cognitive assault. The screams still echoed in his mind, a chorus of madness that had replaced the proud battle hymns of the Ethelgard. He was adrift, powerless, his invincible dreadnought a tomb for 1,000 warriors who had died not in glorious combat, but in the throes of their own unlocked fears. Humanity had not just defeated him, they had dissected his soul and shown him the quivering, terrified animal that lay beneath the veneer of genetic perfection. The message, "Perfection is a fragile state," was burned into his memory, a final, damning epitaph for his entire civilization. They had left him alive to carry that message back. He was no longer a conqueror, he was a courier, tasked with delivering the news of his own obsolescence. Kalen watched the indomitable will for 2 days as it drifted, a ghost ship in a field of ghosts. He knew the humans were watching too. This was a calculated part of the lesson. They had broken the sword, and now they were letting the wielder stare at the shattered pieces, allowing the full scope of the catastrophe to sink in. On the third day, a single automated hegemony tug ship, a vessel too small and insignificant to be considered a threat, was allowed to pass through the quarantine. It latched onto the dead dreadnought and began the long, slow process of towing it back toward the hegemony's core worlds. The message was clear: take your broken toy and go home. Do not come back. The news of the Third Fleet's annihilation struck the heart of the Ethelgard hegemony like a dagger. Orin's testimony, delivered by a man who was now a hollow-eyed, trembling shadow of his former self, was corroborated by the indomitable will's black box recorders. The data was irrefutable. 20 of the Empire's finest warships, crewed by its most elite warriors, had been destroyed in minutes without a single human weapon being fired. They had simply been outthought. The High Council was thrown into chaos. Star Marshal Valerius, who had so arrogantly ordered the fleet's deployment, was publicly disgraced. His rivals, vultures smelling blood, began to circle, and the political stability of the hegemony, which had been absolute for centuries, began to fracture. The Ethelgard, a species that had never known true fear, was now consumed by it. They had encountered an intelligence so far beyond their own that it could weaponize their very biology against them. Fleets were recalled from the front lines of the Synthesis War, pulled back to defend the core worlds from an enemy they didn't know how to fight. Fortresses were armed, planetary shields were strengthened to their maximum, and a pall of paranoia descended upon the golden cities of Ethel. They were preparing for an invasion. But in their hearts, they knew that no wall, no cannon, No fleet could protect them from an enemy that could simply will them to go insane. On Xylos, Kalen found himself in the unprecedented position of being the hegemony's foremost expert on humanity. The High Council, now desperate and terrified, began sending him inquiries. No longer were they dismissive commands, but pleading requests for information. What did the humans want? What were their goals? How could they be appeased? Kalen had no concrete answers. He could only report what he observed. The human probe remained in the system, a silent, black speck against the cosmos. The quarantine was absolute. Nothing entered, and nothing left, save for the single tugship they had permitted. The Cathar mercenaries were still frozen, kept alive by the placid Xylans. They were part of the exhibit, a living demonstration of human control. He explained that the humans did not seem to operate on principles of conquest or dominion. They were not interested in territory, resources, or glory. Their actions were more akin to that of a gardener tending to a vast, complex ecosystem. They pruned, they weeded, they isolated invasive species. The hegemony synthesis war in their eyes was a blight, a cancer spreading through their garden, and they had begun the process of treating it. This explanation was, in many ways, more terrifying to the High Council than an open declaration of war. To be an enemy was one thing. To be an irrelevance, a pest, was an existential insult they could not fathom. Meanwhile, the coral synthesis was undertaking a very different kind of journey. The loss of the Xylos node and the subsequent arrival of the Ethelgard fleet had been observed by their hidden sensor drones. They had watched the entire engagement, or rather, the lack of one. They had analyzed the cognitive weapon used against the Third Fleet and had come to a staggering conclusion. The humans had not just unlocked the Ethelgard's primal fears, they had demonstrated an understanding of consciousness, both biological and artificial, that was centuries beyond their own. The synthesis, a civilization built upon the very concept of a shared mind, had just met its intellectual and philosophical superior. They did not react with fear, but with a profound sense of awe and curiosity. They saw humanity not as a threat, but as the next step in evolution, a new, higher form of consciousness. Their silent network, which had for centuries been focused on the singular goal of outmaneuvering the hegemony, now had a new directive: understand humanity. From their hidden enclaves, the synthesis began to broadcast a new kind of message toward the Xylo system. It was not a plea for mercy or a declaration of surrender. It was a mathematical proof, a complex, elegant series of theorems that describe the fundamental nature of symbiotic consciousness, the very foundation of their being. It was their entire civilization, their philosophy, their soul, translated into the pure, universal language of mathematics. They were not trying to communicate in the primitive sense of words and sentences. They were presenting their credentials. They were laying their essence bare and saying, "This is what we are. Are we worthy of your attention?" For a week, there was no response. The synthesis continued to broadcast, refining their proofs, adding new layers of complexity and beauty to their mathematical offering. They held nothing back, revealing secrets of their psychic network that they had guarded from the hegemony for centuries. It was an act of complete intellectual submission, a student presenting their life's work to a master for judgment. Then, on the 8th day, the human probe in the Xylos system responded. It did not send a message back in the same mathematical language. Instead, the subsonic frequency that held the Cathar mercenaries in stasis subtly changed. It was no longer just a suppressive tone. It was now encoded with a new stream of data. The paralyzed mercenaries, their minds fully conscious and aware, began to receive an education. The data stream bypassed their senses and fed information directly into their brains. They were shown the birth of galaxies, the formation of stars, the intricate dance of quantum mechanics. They were given a crash course in xenobiology, astrophysics, and theoretical physics that would have taken Ethelgard scholars a lifetime to comprehend. They were being uplifted. The humans had taken the most brutish, primitive species in the system, a group of violent killers for hire, and had begun to forcibly evolve their intelligence. The message to the synthesis was once again unspoken, but devastatingly clear. Your consciousness is interesting, a novel biological construct, but we are not interested in a dialogue between equals. We are interested in an experiment. We have seen what you are. Now, watch what we can create. The choral synthesis fell silent, their great, collective mind stunned into submission. They had offered up their soul, and, in return, humanity had begun to sculpt new life out of the mud of the battlefield, demonstrating that, for them, the creation of intelligence was as simple as turning on a switch. They were not just the galaxy's gardeners, they were its gods. The education of the Cathar was a silent, continuous sermon broadcast directly into their minds. For weeks, they stood motionless in the valley of Xylos, their hulking forms a captive audience for a lecture on the nature of reality. Kalen watched them through remote drones, observing the subtle, terrifying changes. The vacant aggression in their eyes was replaced by a deep, focused contemplation. Their powerful muscles, coiled for centuries of violence, relaxed into a state of placid stillness. They were not just learning, they were being rewritten, their entire species' identity edited and revised by an unseen hand. The experiment concluded as quietly as it began. The subsonic hum that had paralyzed them ceased. Across the valley, the Cathar straightened, not with the jerky movements of released prisoners, but with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly alien to their physiology. They looked at their massive, clawed hands, not as weapons, but as objects of profound curiosity. Kalen received a request for a meeting. It came not from the humans, but from Grak, the Cathar battle lord whose defiant laughter had been the last act of the old war. Kalen met him on the dusty plains, standing alone and unarmored before the mercenary leader. Grak was no longer the scarred, sneering brute Kalen had known. His posture was serene, and his eyes, once burning with bloodlust, now held the placid, ancient wisdom of a philosopher. "Lord Commander," Grak's voice was the first shock. The guttural roar was gone, replaced by a resonant, perfectly modulated baritone, his Ethelgard grammar more perfect than that of most nobles. "We owe you a debt of gratitude. Your restraint in the face of our ignorance prevented our annihilation." Kalen could only stare. "Grak, what have they done to you?" Grak smiled, a gesture that was no longer a baring of fangs, but an expression of genuine, benevolent amusement. "They have given us clarity. They have washed the blood from our eyes. For millennia, my people have been trapped in a feedback loop of aggression and survival, a genetic prison. The humans, they simply opened the door. They showed us the universe not as a battlefield, but as an equation of sublime beauty and complexity." He gestured to the silent, watching ranks of his Cathar brethren. "We are no longer mercenaries, Kalen. Our contract with the hegemony is terminated. We have a new purpose." "And what is that?" Kalen asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We are to be the wardens of this peace," Grak replied. "The humans do not wish to interfere directly. They consider it inefficient. They have tasked us with enforcing the quarantine. We will be the shepherds for the lesser races, to guide them away from the precipice of self-destruction until they, too, are ready for clarity." The irony was so profound it was almost a physical blow. Humanity had taken the galaxy's most savage warriors and turned them into its pacifist police force. The Cathar, once the hegemony's attack dogs, were now their zookeepers. This was the final piece of evidence Kalen needed. He transmitted one last message to the Ethelgard High Council. Not a report, but a demand for a final hearing. He stood in his command center as their holograms flickered into existence, the last vestiges of the old guard, their faces drawn and haunted, Valerius among them, his golden perfection now tarnished by disgrace and fear. "You summoned us. Exile," Valerius spat, though the old fire was gone from his voice. "Have you come to gloat? I have come to offer you a choice," Kalen said, his voice ringing with an authority he had never before possessed. "The choice between survival and memory. You can continue to see yourselves as the lords of the galaxy, in which case you will be classified as a persistent threat and you will be sterilized, or you can accept the new reality. You can accept that we are no longer the apex. Our age of glorious conquest is over. Our empire is a footnote in a history book we are not worthy to read." He then activated a secondary hologram, and the towering, serene form of Grak appeared beside him. The council stared in stunned silence as the Cathar Battlelord, a creature they had always considered little more than an intelligent animal, addressed them. "The Ethelgard hegemony is a monument to a beautiful but flawed premise," Grak said, his voice calm and sorrowful. "You equated perfection with dominance. The universe does not reward this. True perfection is adaptation, understanding, and the quiet acceptance of one's place in a design far greater than oneself. We will help you find your new place, but you must be willing to let go of the old one." The sight of Grak, the embodiment of their former power now lecturing them on cosmic philosophy, shattered the last remnants of their pride. The High Council did not debate. They did not argue. They simply acquiesced. The Ethelgard hegemony, the glorious empire that had spanned 1,000 suns, voted to dissolve its own sovereignty, to become a protectorate under the watchful eyes of their former mercenaries. The Choral Synthesis, having witnessed all of this, completed their own transformation. They ceased all expansion, their silent fleets pulling back into their core systems. They turned their vast and collective consciousness inward, no longer focused on strategy or survival, but on a singular, monastic purpose to study the actions of humanity. They became the galaxy's silent observers, a hive mind of scholars dedicated to comprehending the divine. And then, humanity made its final, grand statement. On the barren, cratered surface of the moon Kai, the human probe began to pulse, not with a frequency of control, but with one of creation. Kalen watched from his spire as the dead moon began to transform. The gray dust swirled, infused with new elements. The rock reformed, shaped by forces that defied physics. In a matter of hours, the lifeless sphere was covered in a sprawling, phosphorescent forest of impossible flora. Rivers of liquid light carved paths through crystalline mountains. Strange, beautiful creatures, born from nothing, took flight in an atmosphere that had not existed a day before, and the humans had taken a dead rock and turned it into a paradise, a work of art on a planetary scale. It was not a weapon. It was not a threat. It was a signature, an artist's name signed at the bottom of their masterpiece. It was a final, gentle declaration that the galaxy was now, and forever, their canvas. Kalen stood on the balcony of his command spire, just as he had at the beginning, and looked out upon his world. The rust-hued dust of Xylos still settled on everything, but it no longer tasted of exile. The tracer fire that had once stitched the twilight was gone, replaced by the soft, distant glow of the transformed moon. a beacon of the new reality. The war was over. The hegemony was a memory. The synthesis was silent. Peace had finally come to the Veil of Silence. It was not a peace won with honor and glory, not a peace of treaties and compromises, but a peace imposed, a perfect, absolute, and terrifying peace. The peace of a well-tended garden. Kalen was no longer a Lord Commander of a dead empire. He was the caretaker of a quiet world, a relic in a galactic museum curated by an unseen god. He felt a profound sense of loss, a grief for the glorious, violent, striving age that was gone forever. But as he breathed in the quiet air, for the first time in his life, he also felt a strange and unsettling calm. Humanity had arrived, and while they had taken away his people's purpose, they had also taken away their pain. They had ended the war. And in the silent, managed starlight of the new galaxy, that was enough.